Chapter 53. Bargains Cross. The witches were more than glad to be rid of these mortals in exchange for a few carts. Well, more than a few, they would need many. Even so, they could easily make carts enough to be rid of them. They considered hexing the wood or the wheels or casting illusions on the men. Then they considered it'd be better to get rid of them. The real problem was finding beasts and horses enough for them. In truth, the witches could shape wood to create primitive carts in less than 20 minutes, but the beasts were important meat or useful labor. Still, they would lose far more if the forces of Xing stayed. If they did not leave, they could very well kill the majority of them. Without Malumbra or the matrons, they would have no leadership. Hecate was nowhere to be seen. In fact, it was likely she was letting them die. As they died, their power went to their goddess. She had long since forced all new witches to make a pact with her, granting power to the goddess upon their death. They needed to work quickly. They rallied up horses, donkeys, and strangely, bucks. There were even strange creatures that would never be considered to pull a cart, long since made docile by the poor treatment or magic of the witches. They rather obediently allowed themselves to be strapped to carts on the edge of the road, the bargain of course to their advantage. There was a more experienced witch that hoped to be there to ensure all went well. She brought sisters of the coven to ensure her safety. In total, it was only 10 witches that arranged the carts, but they were glad to do it. The men had proven zealous at the death of witches. To be rid of them before the final blow could be struck. Yes, it was best they accept. Foolish indeed the mortals must have been overwhelmed in seeking to leave, but they were not so weak. They might have been tired and wanting to return home, but they were not helpless. The witches could not see them as easy prey. Darius led his group into the main camp, quietly killing whatever witches along the way through the bog. The witches' main encampment was full of prisoners, but not ones who could be easily set free. It looked as if they were being fed and bred by witches. He and his 12 swordsmen sought out whatever witches could be found making masks or hypnotizing the new recruits of men and women. They were filled with rage, but quiet, getting skillful at moving behind witches and slitting their throats. Often two would strike the same witch. Those that tried to curse would find it deflected by the black blades. One after another, Darius got to work. The witches' eyes were mostly on the grand company in the clearing heading towards the carts. The eyes would not be upon the caravan of hundreds, not a dozen who traveled light. Their magic would have trouble seeing them. They could hardly have much of a chance at spotting the surprise attack coming. At the main encampment, Darius looked around for witches after finishing off a few dozen. It was quite messy work, but it was done. He began searching for his original goal, an altar of sorts for the goddess. He grinned and looked over it. As suspected, gold and jewels were placed at the altar of Hecate. His black armor allowed him to approach without getting fried by hexes and traps. The magic around the altar was strong, but it was pushed away by the black armor. He motioned over to one of the men, who pulled out a bag and began scooping up whatever valuables could be found, as well as pushing away the flesh and blood atop some of the finer treasures. Darius kept going through the camp. He knew there would be magical artifacts in a place such as this, but he did not have the skill to identify it. As valuable as that gold and jewels might be, it was not as valuable as the artifacts in the encampment. Sadly, he doubted he'd be able to carry it with his armor or be able to find them in time. However, tribute and treasure were easy enough to spot. In the main encampment, there were several altars to Hecate. Although there were signs of human sacrifices, there were often other treasures. He and his men had to kill witches, but for the most part the most powerful ones were a part of the attack force. The ones near the encampment were not expecting them and made easy kills. They made use of what time they had. He motioned to another man as he cleared yet another altar. In simple words, he was robbing them. He was wearing armor that protected him from hexes and traps. There would be no legal retribution, and he was killing them to do it. The men with him were trusted, as were the same who went with him into Blackmaw. Old soldiers who still believed in their commander and even now serving Xing. But in truth they did not fight for Xing. They fought for something greater, and they somehow knew it. Darius did not speak of it, but he was reborn with purpose after he left Blackmaw. They were convinced they were a part of some greater plan. They gathered gold and jewels, but could not carry much. At worst, they simply gathered valuable currency they could find. They were careful not to weigh themselves down too much. There were bags that could magically hold more items and reduce the weight, but their weapons would likely ruin it. So they had to carry whatever riches they could the old-fashioned way. After no less than 4 altars to Hykatai were amply robbed, they began to make their way out, cutting ropes on cages of slaves and hoping they would run away. They did not. No one ran. They stayed with the coven. Saddened, the black-bladed men ran into the woods with their loot and went towards the place where the carts could be found. Darius had to move quickly to catch up to main caravan, but he made efforts not to move so fast that he did not tire out his men. They were too valuable. If it came down to it, they needed to fight at a moment's notice. So every now and again he reduced the speed to a walk. He began to plan with them and give them each orders one after another. What to do with the loot and what to do he told them with his plan with the carts. He met their gazes, telling them piece by piece of what was to be done. They listened and did not interrupt. Then, when he was done, he stole a saying from Meredith. "Everything dies." They chanted back, "Everything dies." They made ready into the forest, Darius separating himself from the witches.
Chapter 54. Bog Trek. Meredith reached what appeared to be a road, or at least what might pass as one, as Alyssa guided him with what he supposed were her winged friends. Her fizzy, bird-nest-like hair smelled. She was no joy to carry. "Don't even think of trying to transform," he warned her. Alyssa gave him a perplexed look. "Blind fool! Your weapon would prevent that. I am trying not to die from the aura emanating from it." He rolled his eyes. "You smell like a plague. So we're even." Alyssa grinned at him. "We are not even, little mortal. You have killed my sisters, and I will have my vengeance one day." Meredith sighed, then dropped her on the ground, then whipped out his weapon. She cried out in fear as he approached her with a black blade. "I say we kill her here and now. What do you think, August?" He looked to the paladin, who played the part of the good cop. She stepped up. "This is foolish. Why would she lie?" Meredith smirked. "Maybe to get some last-minute vengeance. Maybe because she's a murderess and she acts like we're the reason all this bad stuff happened to her. You really believe it, don't you?" She didn't admit it, but yes, she blamed them entirely for everything. Augustana looked to the witch. "Do you truly believe we can tolerate your kind? Stealing children, warping the wills of men, eating humans, enslaving animals? Corrupting nature, and then you strike at a town of woodsmen and expect us not to retaliate? You've dug your own grave, and now you seek to bury yourself." Alyssa hissed, but it was easier to see them as evil. She thought of her friends and used that to justify her hatred. But for now she supposed leading to the encampment would save more of her kindred sisters. "I do not lie. Travel the road, and we will have carts for your wounded. We have beasts and carts enough to be rid of you, and we're glad of it." Meredith picked her back up and kept walking. With her injury she couldn't pull off much, and at least now they were on the road. That alone was a substantial help. "So how far are these carts?" Sven was being carried, and Kenzen rejoined the group, exhausted to the point where someone had to help him along. They were exhausted, and many needed help walking, but at least they were relatively safe. They could really use carts, and was glad someone thought to ask for them. In the end, Alyssa didn't know how far. She could tell they were getting closer. "Expect other witches near the carts. We will want your leader to be the one to speak to you. Are we agreed?" Meredith shrugged. "I am fine if you try to bargain with Darius. He isn't exactly someone who makes easy prey." Alyssa smiled. "He's never bargained with a witch." Meredith almost felt a chuckle coming. "And a witch has never bargained with us. I wouldn't prepare for a typical agreement with Darius." Alyssa knew well they would try some sort of crafty trick that even with magical users she doubted Darius would find. Even observant men could not possibly know what the witches had prepared. What's worse is Darius could not use magic, and only knowing the basics would doubtless fail to see the endless loopholes. Further, for a military man who thought tactically, he would fail to see the reasoning of the witches. He would most certainly focus on things like goals or objectives, when witches simply might have an objective to cause them pain or annoyance. It was something mortals failed at constantly. Lying was not the same as deception, as they would no doubt learn.